Welcome, I am Dr. Watson, your companion at 22 1B Baker Street. Tonight, we enter the shadows of the Beryl Coronet, a tale of winter fear, shattered trust, and a royal treasure stained by suspicion. Draw nearer. The fire is waiting. Tonight, we enter the shadows of the adventure of the Beryl Coronet, a tale of winter fear, shattered trust, and a royal treasure stained by suspicion. Draw nearer. The fire is waiting. There are some mornings which arrive quietly and pass forgotten into history, and then there are mornings which carry, hidden beneath their frost and silence, the first footsteps of catastrophe. It was during one such February morning that this remarkable affair began. The snow of the previous day still covered Baker Street in a pale and glittering mantle. From our bow window I watched the street below, where the traffic had churned the centre into dark slush, while the edges remained bright and untouched beneath the winter sun. London seemed hushed, as though wrapped beneath a great white blanket. Holmes lounged in his dressing-gown beside the fire, his long fingers folded together, and his eyes half closed in that deceptive manner which often led strangers to mistake him for idle. I had risen and taken my usual station at the window. "Holmes," said I, "there appears to be a madman approaching." My companion stirred at once. "A madman," he repeated lazily. I pointed downward. The gentleman advancing along Baker Street was certainly a strange sight. He was no ragged vagrant, but rather a man of considerable dignity, tall, strongly built, and perhaps nearing 50 years of age. His attire proclaimed wealth and position: a black frock coat, a polished hat, carefully tailored grey trousers. Yet his conduct stood in spurred contradiction to his appearance. He ran, not with the easy stride of an athletic man, but with desperate little leaps and awkward lunges, his hands jerking wildly, and his head twisting from side to side, as though pursued by invisible horrors. Even from our window I could perceive the anguish upon his face. "What on earth can have happened?" I asked. Holmes had risen, and now stood beside me, his hands deep in the pockets of his gown. "He's looking up at the house numbers," said he. The man stumbled onward. "I believe," Holmes continued softly, "that he is coming here." "To you?" "I think so. Observe the symptoms." There came suddenly the violent ringing of our bell. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson admitted the stranger. He burst into our sitting-room breathing heavily, his face pale with agitation, and his eyes in such naked misery that my first amusement vanished at once. Indeed, I confess I was shocked. He swayed where he stood and clutched at his hair like a man standing upon the very brink of madness. Then, before either Holmes or I could speak, he sprang toward the wall and struck his head against it with startling force. We rushed forward together and restrained him. Holmes guided him gently into an armchair. No man possessed a more soothing manner when compassion was required. He seated himself beside our visitor and spoke with quiet reassurance. "You have come to tell me your trouble," said he. "Take your time. Recover yourself first. and then we shall see what may be done." For some moments the gentleman struggled to master his emotions. At last he drew a handkerchief across his brow and looked up. Said he bitterly, "You think me mad." "I think," replied Holmes, "that you have suffered greatly." The man gave a broken nod. "God knows I have. Public disgrace I might endure, private sorrow also, but both together, arriving suddenly, and in so terrible a form, have nearly destroyed me." His voice faltered. "And worse still," he continued, "the danger extends beyond myself. One of the noblest persons in England may suffer unless this dreadful matter is resolved." At those words, I observed a faint sharpening in Holmes's expression. "Pray proceed," said he calmly. "Tell us who you are." The gentleman straightened. "My name," said he, "is Alexander Holder, of the banking house Holder and Stevenson." The name was immediately familiar. Indeed, Holder and Stevenson ranked among most respected private banking firms in London, and Alexander Holder himself was widely regarded as a man of unimpeachable honour and immense wealth. What calamity, I wondered, could have reduced such a figure to this state? Holmes remained motionless. "And what has happened, Mr. Holder?" he asked. The banker clasped his trembling hands together. "It concerns," said he quietly, "a treasure entrusted to my care, a treasure of national importance." He leaned forward, "And unless Heaven has mercy upon me, I may already be ruined." The fire burned softly beside us, and outside our windows the pale winter morning rested over Baker Street. Yet within our sitting-room sat a man whose world had already collapsed. Alexander Holder clasped his hands together, as though they alone prevented him from falling apart. Holmes, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. There was a singular gift in my friend's manner. His silence itself possessed weight. Many men, placed before so calm and attentive a listener, found themselves compelled to speak plainly. So it proved with our troubled visitor. "I must ask your patience, Mr. Holmes," said Holder. "The matter is delicate beyond measure, and time presses heavily upon me." Holmes inclined his head. "You may speak with complete confidence." The banker drew a long breath. "As you know," said he, "in our profession, one must not only safeguard wealth, but also invest it wisely. Much of our business involves loans, secured against valuable property, paintings, plate, jewels, and other possessions belonging to distinguished families." I nodded, for this practice was well known. "Yesterday morning," he continued, "I sat in my office when my clerk presented me with a visiting card. He hesitated. I confess I started when I saw the name. The gentleman lowered his voice. I shall not reveal it even now. Let me say only that it belonged to one of the highest and most honoured persons in England, a name known throughout the civilized world." Even Holmes's eyelids lifted slightly at this. Holder continued, "When he entered my office, he wasted no time upon ceremony." The banker now repeated the conversation as he remembered it, and I shall recount it as faithfully as memory allows. "Holder," said my visitor, "I understand that your firm advances money upon security." "Certainly," I replied, "provided the security is sufficient. I require £50,000 immediately." At this, I confess I started. Even to a prosperous banker, such a sum represented a serious matter. Holder continued. He explained that a large payment would shortly become due to him, and that the money would be repaid within 4 days. Holmes leaned slightly forward. And you agreed? I was willing, said Holder. Yet, duty required me to insist upon proper security. The banker's fingers tightened together. My visitor then produced a black morocco case, which he had brought with him. Here the man paused once more, as though the memory itself weighed heavily upon him. You have heard, said he, of the Beryl Coronet? At the words, I felt a thrill, for the Beryl Coronet was no ordinary ornament. Even in those days it ranked among the treasured possessions of England, an object of extraordinary beauty and historic value. I answered, Holder said, that it was among the nation's greatest treasures. His visitor opened the case, and there, resting upon velvet, lay the coronet itself. Even now, years later, I can almost see the wonder upon Holder's face as he described it. The coronet was fashioned of gold, so exquisitely worked that it resembled frozen sunlight. Set within it were 39 magnificent beryls, each gem possessing a brilliance beyond price. My visitor informed me, said Holder, that the lowest estimate placed its value at twice the sum he requested. He swallowed, and he offered it to me as security. I looked toward Holmes. My companion had steepled his fingers and closed his eyes, though I knew perfectly well that not a syllable escaped him. I admit, Holder continued, that I hesitated. He had done so, not because he doubted the coronet's worth, but because he feared the responsibility. The distinguished owner, however, reassured him the arrangement would last only 4 days. Monday morning, he promised, the coronet would be reclaimed. I entrust it to you, said he, because your reputation assures me it shall remain safe. But understand this clearly. Should any injury come to it, the consequences would be disastrous. The beryls are unique. They cannot be replaced. Holder gave a weary shake of the head. I released the money and watched him depart. For some time afterward, he told us, the jewel case had remained upon his desk. Though banker by profession, he had begun to feel not triumph, but dread. The burden weighed upon him. A national treasure sat beneath his care. If anything befell it, scandal would shake England. At last, said Holder, I secured it within my private safe. Yet, as evening approached, anxiety grew stronger still. Bank faults, after all, were not invincible. He pictured thieves, forced locks, headlines, disgrace, and so he made a decision. For the few days remaining, said he, I would keep the coronet with me personally. He summoned a cab. The precious case accompanied him home to his residence at Streatham. Only when he carried it upstairs and locked it within the bureau of his dressing-room did he breathe freely once more. Holder looked toward Holmes with hollow eyes. And that, said he quietly, was the beginning of my ruin. Holmes opened his eyes. You mentioned your household earlier, said he softly. Before we go farther, I should like to understand everyone who lived beneath your roof. Holder bowed his head. Yes, said he, you must know them all, for the tragedy begins there. And with those words, the unhappy banker prepared to reveal the people closest to him. Alexander Holder sat before us with the weariness of a man who no longer feared disgrace, for he had already imagined it in its fullest shape. Outside, the winter light dimmed behind Baker Street's rooftops, while Holmes watched him with patient attention. "You wished to know my household," said the banker quietly. "Very well. It is necessary that you understand every soul beneath my roof." Holmes inclined his head. "Please continue." Holder folded his hands. "My servants are few," said he. "My groom and page sleep outside the house and need not concern us. I employ 3 maidservants who have served me faithfully for years, and whose honesty I would trust without hesitation." He paused. "There is also Lucy Parr." The name lingered. "She has only been with us several months, though she arrived with excellent references and has given satisfaction in her duties." Holder managed a faint, troubled smile. "She is a remarkably pretty girl." I noticed Holmes's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. "A circumstance," Holder continued, "which has attracted admirers." He explained that young men occasionally linger near the property in hopes of seeing her. "This is the sole complaint we have had concerning her," said he, "though I believe her entirely respectable." Holmes merely nodded. "So much for the servants," Holder went on. "My family itself is small." Here his expression darkened. "I am a widower. There are few words spoken with greater loneliness. My only son is Arthur." At once I sensed that this name carried both love and sorrow. Holder stared into the fire. "He has been my great disappointment." He spoke without anger now, only exhaustion. When his wife died, Arthur had become the entire centre of his affection. "I could deny him nothing," said the banker. "Perhaps that was my error." Holmes remained silent. Holder confessed that he had hoped Arthur would inherit the banking business, yet the young man possessed little taste for commerce or responsibility. "He is generous by nature," said the father sadly, "but reckless. Arthur had fallen into fashionable company, young gentlemen of wealth, and expensive habits, cards, horse racing, club debts. Again and again he had returned home seeking money, and I gave it," Holder admitted, "far too often. But there was one influence above all others which troubled him. A friend," said he bitterly. "Sir George Burnwell." At that name, I noticed Holmes's fingers move slightly against one another. Holder described the man vividly. Sir George was older than Arthur, polished and worldly, possessed of striking appearance and brilliant conversation. "He has travelled widely," said Holder. "He speaks charmingly. One scarcely notices how completely he commands attention." The banker shook his head. "And yet," his voice lowered, "when I reflect calmly, I confess I distrust him deeply." There had been something in Burnwell's eyes, he said, something cold beneath the charm, a cynical spirit. Holder murmured. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And your son admired this gentleman?" "Unfortunately, yes. Burnwell's influence over Arthur had proved difficult to break. Even when Arthur attempted to reform his habits, the older man drew him back." "I cannot wholly blame the boy," Holder said quietly. "There are men whose personalities possess dangerous magnetism." Holmes said nothing. "And now," Holder continued, "there remains only Mary. At the mention of her name, a warmth softened his face for the first time. She is my niece. Her father, Holder's brother, had died some years earlier, leaving her alone. I adopted her, said he, and have loved her ever since as my own daughter. His expression brightened faintly. She's a sunshine of my home. He described her with unmistakable affection. Mary was beautiful, yet gentle, intelligent, yet modest, an excellent manager of the household, and beloved by everyone who knew her. I scarcely know how I should live without her, he admitted. Then came the curious revelation. There's been only one matter in which she opposed my wishes. Arthur, it seemed, had long loved his cousin. Twice he had proposed marriage. Twice Mary had refused. This puzzled me. Holder himself seemed equally bewildered. He loved her devotedly, said he, and I believed, perhaps foolishly, that marriage to her might have steadied him. His voice grew heavy. But now, such hopes are finished forever. The room fell silent. Holmes sat with closed eyes, though I knew he missed nothing. Holder drew a long breath. You now understand the household, said he. He looked from Holmes to myself. And with that knowledge, gentlemen, I may continue. His fingers gripped the arm of his chair. It was after dinner yesterday evening, he said, while we sat together taking coffee, that I made the fatal mistake. I leaned forward, for I sensed instinctively that we approached the true heart of the tragedy. I told Arthur and Mary, Holder said slowly, that a great treasure rested beneath our roof. And at those words, Holmes opened his eyes. The flames crackled softly in our Baker Street hearth, while Alexander Holder continued his unhappy recollection. I remember how his fingers trembled as though the events of that dreadful night still lived vividly beneath his skin. It was after dinner, said he, while we sat taking coffee in the drawing-room. The household, as he described it, had gathered peacefully enough. Mary sat near the lamp, with her usual composed grace. Arthur lounged nearby, restless as ever, yet outwardly cheerful. The evening itself appeared ordinary, and yet, as so often happens in life, catastrophe had already entered the room unseen. I told them, Holder continued, of the treasure entrusted to my care. He had been careful, he said, to conceal the name of his illustrious client. But he spoke freely of the object itself, a priceless coronet of national importance, resting upstairs within his dressing-room. I could easily imagine the effect such a revelation would have produced. Arthur and Mary listened with fascination. They begged to see it, Holder said, but I refused. A prudent decision, certainly. Yet Holmes, seated beside the fire, remained unreadable. Holder continued. Lucy Parr had served the coffee. He hesitated. I believed she had already left the room, though I cannot swear the door was entirely shut. At the time he thought nothing of it, nor perhaps would most men, but I noticed Holmes's fingers pressed together lightly. Arthur, meanwhile, had shown particular curiosity. Where have you placed it? He asked. In my own bureau, I answered. Arthur had laughed. "Well," said he, "let us hope burglars do not visit tonight." Holder had assured him that the bureau was locked. Yet Arthur answered with curious carelessness. "Any key might open it," said he. "When I was younger, I often managed it myself with the lumber room key." Holder dismissed the remark as idle talk. Arthur, he said, possessed a reckless manner of speech, and frequently joked where seriousness was required. The conversation ended. Coffee concluded. The family separated for the night. Yet scarcely had Holder retired upstairs when Arthur followed him. The father's expression darkened. He entered my room with unusual gravity. I could picture the scene well. The banker weary from responsibility. The son troubled and uncertain. Arthur stood with lowered eyes. "Father," said he, "can you lend me £200? Even now, Holder's voice hardened slightly at the memory. The request, it seemed, had not been the first. Indeed, it was the third demand that month. I refused him sharply. Arthur, however, pressed the matter. Club obligations weighed upon him. If he failed to pay, he said, disgrace awaited. Then perhaps disgrace would do you good, I told him. The banker's shame was evident, even in recollection, but at the time anger mastered him. Arthur answered quietly, "You have been generous to me before, but I must have this money somehow. If you cannot help me, I shall be forced to seek another means." Holder struck the arm of his chair. I would not yield. His refusal proved absolute. No more advances, no more debts, no more rescue. Arthur bowed coldly. Then he left, without another word. Silence settled once more over the house, yet unease remained. When he had gone, Holder said, I reopened my bureau. The coronet remained secure. He inspected it personally. Satisfied, he locked it away again. Even then, however, anxiety troubled him. The responsibility felt almost unbearable. And so, abandoning his usual habit of leaving such matters to Mary, he decided to inspect the house himself before sleeping. This small decision, so innocent, so ordinary, would later assume terrible importance. He descended the staircase, and there he encountered Mary. She stood beside the hall window. Holder paused. The memory clearly disturbed him. As he approached, Mary closed and fastened the window. Her face appeared slightly unsettled. "Father," she asked, "did you give Lucy permission to go out tonight?" He had not. Mary explained that she had just seen the maid returning by the back entrance. She believed, Holder said, that Lucy had merely slipped outside to meet someone near the gate. The banker frowned. Improper, perhaps, but hardly criminal. Still, Mary thought such behaviour unsafe. Holder promised the matter would be addressed in the morning. Then came the question. "Are all the doors and windows secure?" I asked. Mary assured him they were. So father and daughter parted. "I kissed her good night," said Holder softly. There was something painfully tender in the memory. He returned upstairs. Soon afterward he slept. Here the banker paused and looked helplessly toward Holmes. "I have tried," said he, "to conceal nothing." Holmes inclined his head. "You have been admirably clear." Holder exhaled slowly. "What followed?" he said. is the part I most dread to tell. The room itself seemed to grow still, for we had arrived at the hour when peace ended. Holder clasped his trembling hands. "I am not a heavy sleeper," he said quietly. And that night, anxiety me made sleep lighter still. He lowered his voice. About 2 a.m, I awoke. The fire crackled softly behind us. "What woke me?" he continued. "I could not at first say. The sound had already ceased. He lay listening. Then came another noise. Footsteps, soft, stealthy, and very near. Holder's face turned pale, even in recollection. "They came," said he, "from the next room. I confess, I felt a chill, despite the warmth of our chambers." The banker rose from bed, fear pounding within him. He crossed toward the dressing-room door and looked inside. What he saw there, he told us, shattered his life forever. There are moments in life, dear listener, when a single glance changes everything. As Alexander Holder continued his account at winter morning in Baker Street, I observed that even the memory of what followed seemed almost too painful for him to endure. Holmes sat silent beside the fire. The banker drew a shaking breath. "I awoke," said he softly, "and heard footsteps. The sound had come from the adjoining dressing-room." At once suspicion and terror seized him. The coronet, that priceless burden which had haunted his thoughts all evening. Holder slipped from bed. The house lay silent about him. He crossed the floor with pounding heart and peered around the dressing-room doorway. Then he stopped. Even now, the man's face grew ashen. And briefly, there illuminated by the half-raised gas lamp, stood his son Arthur. He wore only shirt and trousers, hastily dressed, as though summoned from sleep. And in his hands, Holder's voice nearly failed him, he held the coronet. I confess that at this stage of the narrative, my own conclusions hardened instantly. The picture appeared dreadful and unmistakable. Holder continued. At first, I scarcely understood what I saw. Arthur stood beside the bureau, gripping the golden circlet. More terrible still, he appeared to be bending it. Indeed, the father swore he saw the young man wrenching violently at the jewel, as though attempting to tear something free. Then came the cry. "Arthur," I shouted, "you villain, you thief! How dare you touch that coronet?" The words rang through the sleeping house. Arthur started violently. The coronet slipped from his hands. Holder rushed forward and snatched it up. His eyes travelled over the gold. Then horror struck him. One corner had been twisted and broken. 3 of the precious beryls were missing. As the banker spoke these words, he pressed trembling fingers against his brow. "I believe," said he, "that madness seized me. Small wonder. To hold in one's hands a damaged national treasure, to know that irreplaceable jewels had vanished beneath one's own roof, was enough to unseat reason." "You blackguard!" I cried. "You have ruined me." "Where are the stones?" Arthur stared at him. "Stolen," he said. "Yes, stolen." The father seized him by the shoulder. There are 3 gems missing. You know where they are." Arthur's face turned pale, yet, according to Holder, surprise rather than guilt appeared there. "There are none missing," he answered. The denial only inflamed his father further. "Liar!" I shouted. "Did I not see you trying to tear away another piece?" Here, for the first time, Arthur's temper rose. The young man straightened. "You have insulted me enough," said he. "I shall say no more. If this is your opinion of me, I will leave this house in the morning, and make my own way in the world. I remember glancing toward Holmes then." My companion's face remained unreadable. Holder, however, had already passed beyond calm. "You shall leave in police custody," I answered. The banker's voice cracked. I was beside myself. To his mind, the evidence stood undeniable. Arthur had been discovered, in possession of Coronet. The jewels were gone. What explanation could exist? At that very moment, the household, roused by the commotion, hurried toward the room. Mary arrived first. The banker paused. What followed had clearly marked him in deeply. "She looked from Arthur to the coronet," he said, "and understood immediately that something dreadful had happened. Then came a piercing cry. Mary collapsed, senseless upon the floor. The servants rushed in. Confusion spread through the house. Holder sent instantly for the police. Meanwhile, Arthur neither fled nor protested. He stood silently, his arms folded, his expression dark and wounded. When the inspector arrived with a constable, the young man spoke at last. "Do you intend to charge me?" Holder answered that the affair had ceased to be private. The coronet, after all, belonged not merely to an individual, but to England itself. Law must take its course. Arthur listened quietly. Then he made a curious request. "Allow me 5 minutes outside before you arrest me." Holder's eyes flashed, even in recollection. I refused at once. How could he do otherwise? To him, the request sounded like desperation, an opportunity to flee, or worse, to conceal the missing jewels. Yet the father still hoped confession might save them all. He pleaded with Arthur, not for himself alone, but for the honor of a distinguished figure whose name remained hidden from us. "Tell me where the stones are," I begged him. "Everything may yet be forgiven." Arthur answered coldly, "Keep your forgiveness." No persuasion moved him. No threat loosened his tongue. The police searched him. Nothing. They searched his room. Nothing. They searched the house itself. Still nothing. And throughout the ordeal, Arthur remained stubbornly silent. "This morning," Holder said hoarsely, "they took him to a cell." The poor man clasped his hands together. "I have lost everything," he whispered. "My honor, the coronet, and my son." His grief filled the room like heavy fog. For several moments Holmes said nothing. He sat with knitted brows and lowered eyes. At last he spoke. "Do you receive much company at your house, Mr. Holder?" The banker blinked. The question appeared to surprise him. "Very little," said he. And thus, to my astonishment, Holmes began his investigation, not with accusation, but with questions that seemed to wander far from the obvious guilt before us. At that moment, I confess, I could not imagine where his thoughts were leading. Yet I had already learned one truth concerning Sherlock Holmes. When his mind appeared most distant from the answer, he was often nearest to it. I shall confess something to you, dear listener. As Alexander Holder finished recounting the arrest of his unfortunate son, I believed the matter already solved. Indeed. What conclusion could any ordinary observer reach? Arthur Holder had been discovered in the dead of night, standing beside the bureau, the coronet in his own hands, and 3 priceless jewels missing. To me, the evidence appeared overwhelming. Yet Sherlock Holmes, as so often happened, had already wandered beyond the boundaries of ordinary thought. He sat motionless for several moments, his eyes fixed upon the dancing fire. At length he stirred. "Did you receive much company, Mr. Holder?" he asked. The banker looked surprised. "Very little," said he. "Only my business partner and his family on occasion, and sometimes a friend of Arthur's, Sir George Burnwell." "Yes," said Holder. "He has visited several times lately." Holmes nodded faintly. "You yourself are not much given to society." "No, neither Mary nor I care greatly for it." Holmes steepled his fingers. "That is somewhat unusual in a young lady." Holder gave a weary sigh. "Mary is quiet by nature. Besides, she is no child. She is 24. Holmes's gaze remained thoughtful. "This affair has affected her deeply, terribly," answered the banker. "Indeed, I think she suffers even more than I. And neither of you," Holmes asked gently, "harbours any doubt of your son's guilt?" The question seemed almost absurd to Holder. "How could there be doubt?" he cried. "I saw him with my own eyes." Holmes did not argue. Instead, he asked another question. "The coronet itself, was the remainder damaged?" "Yes," said Holder. "Twisted." Holmes leaned back. "Then skillful," said he quietly, "that your son may have been attempting to straighten it." The banker stared. For a moment, even I found the suggestion extraordinary. "Bless you, Mr. Holmes," Holder said sadly. "You seek kindly explanations where none exist. But what business had he there at all? And if innocent, why say nothing?" Holmes's eyes glimmered. "A fair question," said he, "though I might also ask, if guilty, why not lie?" The words struck me. Holder blinked. Holmes continued. "Silence, Mr. Holder, is a curious thing. It may condemn or protect. I remember feeling the first faint stirrings of uncertainty." Holmes now turned to the events of the night itself. "You mentioned," said he, "that a sound awakened you." "Yes." "What did the police make of it?" "They believed it may have been Arthur closing his bedroom door." Holmes snorted softly. "A burglar who announces himself to the household? Most considerate." Holder looked uncomfortable. "They could discover no better explanation. And the missing gems, they can continue searching. Floors, furniture, garden, everything." Holmes sat forward. "Outside as well?" "Yes, they have searched the grounds thoroughly." At this, Holmes rose suddenly. His energy, when action seized him, always startled me. "My dear sir," said he, "have you considered how improbable your theory truly is?" Holder looked bewildered. Holmes paced slowly before the hearth. According to the accepted account, your son descended during the night, opened the bureau, broke away part of the coronet by force, concealed 3 gems so cleverly that no search can uncover them, then returned, still holding the remaining coronet, and chose that precise moment to expose himself to discovery. He stopped. Is that reasonable? Holder spread his hands helplessly. But what alternative exists? Holmes turned sharply. That, said he, is precisely what we must determine. His eyes shone now with growing interest. There are times when a case awakens in Holmes something almost boyish, a fierce delight beneath the cold intellect. I recognized signs. He had found a puzzle worthy of him. At last he reached for his hat. Come, Mr. Holder, said he. We shall go to Streatham. The banker stared. Immediately, if you please. Holmes looked toward me. You accompany us, Watson? I require no persuasion. Though my own mind still inclined toward Arthur's guilt, I had learned never to dismiss Holmes's instincts lightly. Within the hour, we found ourselves journeying southward, through wintry London. Throughout the ride, Holmes spoke scarcely a word. He sat sunk in deep contemplation, his hat drawn low, and his chin resting upon his breast. The banker, meanwhile, appeared strangely encouraged. Even the smallest hope had revived him. A brief railway journey, a short walk at last, brought us to Fairbank, his residence at Streatham. I remember it well. The house stood modest yet handsome, built of pale stone, and set back from the road behind iron gates. Snow covered the lawn in silent whiteness. To one side ran a narrow tradesman's path, leading towards the kitchen. On the other stretched a quiet lane beside the stables. Holmes halted. Without explanation, he left us at the entrance. I shall first inspect the grounds alone. And with that he disappeared into the snow. Holder and I entered the house to wait. We had not long been seated when the dining-room door opened. A young lady entered. Though pale beyond description, she possessed striking beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an expression of restrained sorrow, which impressed me profoundly. Without noticing me, she crossed swiftly toward her uncle. "You have ordered Arthur released?" she asked. The banker shook his head. And thus, for the first time, I met Miss Mary Holder. The winter daylight lay pale across the dining-room at Fairbank. As the young lady entered, I remember her still. There are faces which beauty alone cannot explain, faces carrying some deeper impression of sorrow or gentleness that lingers in the memory long afterward. Such was Miss Mary Holder. She stood somewhat above middle height, slender and graceful, with dark hair framing features made startling by their extreme pallor. Her eyes, large and shadowed, wore the unmistakable traces of tears. Yet it was not weakness, I observed. Rather, she carried herself with admirable composure, as though grief had been mastered only through great effort. Without noticing me, she moved directly toward her uncle. "You have ordered Arthur released?" she asked. The banker shook his head heavily. "No, Mary, The truth must be discovered. Her hand rested gently upon his shoulder. But I am certain he is innocent. There was quiet conviction in her voice. You know what a woman feels, she said softly. I know he has done no wrong. Holder looked worn beyond words. How can I believe otherwise? He asked. As he saw him with the coronet. Mary's face tightened. Oh, but perhaps he merely picked it up. Perhaps. My dear, interrupted Holder sadly, the facts are too terrible. She clasped her hands together. It is dreadful even to imagine Arthur in prison. I confess her distress moved me deeply. Whether mistaken or not, her loyalty seemed sincere. At that moment footsteps sounded in the hall. Sherlock Holmes entered. He paused upon the mat to brush snow from his boots, and as his sharp grey eyes lifted toward Mary, I noticed that peculiar alertness which always signalled the beginning of careful observation. Holder introduced us. My niece, Miss Mary Holder. Holmes bowed slightly. I believe, said he, that we share the same hope that your cousin may yet be clear of wrongdoing. A faint colour touched her cheeks. I pray you succeed. Holmes regarded her steadily. Perhaps, said he, you might assist me with a few questions. She agreed at once. You heard nothing unusual during the night? Holmes asked. Nothing, said she, until my uncle cried out. You secured the windows yourself before retiring? Yes. And they remained fastened this morning? I believe so. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. You mentioned to your uncle that one of the maids had gone outside. Mary glanced briefly toward Holder. Yes, Lucy Parr. She has a sweetheart. So we understand. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. You observed her returning. I did. By which entrance? The kitchen door. And you saw the man as well? Yes. Holmes's tone remained casual. Do you know him? Mary answered readily. He is the greengrocer who delivers vegetables, Francis Prosper. Then Holmes asked a curious question. He stood to the left of the path, did he not? Her brows lifted. Yes. And he possesses its wooden leg? I confess even I stared. Mary's eyes widened visibly. Why, yes. For the briefest instant something passed across her expression. Not merely surprise, something closer to alarm. You are extraordinary, she said. But Holmes did not smile. I have often observed, and praise approached him during an investigation. He scarcely appeared to hear it. Instead, his gaze sharpened. I should like now, said he, to examine the house further. He began downstairs. The great hall window overlooking the stable lane attracted immediate attention. Holmes opened it carefully and bent low, employing his lens to inspect the sill and frame. He remained there longer than I expected. At last he rose. Now upstairs, if you please. We accompanied him. The dressing-room proved plain and orderly, a practical chamber containing carpet, mirror, and the large bureau where the coronet had rested. Holmes went directed toward the lock. Which key opened this bureau? He asked. Ola indicated one lying nearby. The lumber room key. Arthur himself mentioned it. Holmes lifted it delicately and inserted it into the lock. The bureau opened smoothly, noiseless, said he. He examined the mechanism closely, so quiet, he added, that one might open it without waking a sleeper nearby. Holder swallowed. Holmes next requested the coronet itself. The damaged jewel lay within its case. Even diminished, it remained magnificent. 36 great beryls gleamed against the gold. Yet one corner had been violently torn away. Holmes studied it with intense attention. Then, quite unexpectedly, he turned toward Holder. "Will oblige me by breaking off this remaining corner." The banker recoiled. "Certainly not. Then perhaps I shall attempt it." To my astonishment, Holmes seized the coronet firmly and exerted his strength. I had seen him bend steel pokers and overpower powerful men, yet here the gold resisted fiercely. He relaxed at last. "Interesting, you see," cried Holder. Holmes nodded. "It yields slightly, but considerable force would be required." He laid the coronet carefully down. "And if broken," said he, "it would produce a noise, not unlike a pistol shot." The room fell silent. I noticed Holder staring uncertainly. Holmes looked at him. "You slept only a few yards away." "Yes, and heard nothing." The banker's face clouded. "No," Holmes said quietly. "Curious." His eyes then moved toward Mary. "And what do you think, Miss Holder?" She met his gaze calmly. "I confess myself as puzzled as my uncle." Holmes nodded once. Then he asked another question. "When your cousin was discovered, he wore no shoes?" "Only shirt and trousers," said Holder. "No slippers?" "None." For a moment, Holmes stood perfectly still. Then suddenly, his expression brightened. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I knew that look. He had seen something, or perhaps realized something. "Excellent," said he softly. And without further explanation, he returned toward the staircase. I followed with growing curiosity, for although I could not yet understand his reasoning, I sensed that Holmes was no longer searching blindly. He was following a trail. I have often remarked, dear listener, that Sherlock Holmes possessed a singular talent for appearing most mysterious at the very moment when his mind had grown most certain. Such was his manner to Fairbank. Having completed his examination of the dressing-room, Holmes descended the staircase without offering explanation. I followed closely, while Miss Holder trailed beside me in visible perplexity. Our companion paused only long enough to take up his coat. "With your permission," said he, "I shall continue outside." He requested that none accompany him. "Footprints," he explained, "are delicate witnesses and easily disturbed." There was sense in this, though I confess I felt some disappointment at being excluded. And so Holmes departed alone into the snowy grounds. The banker and I returned to the dining room. There we waited. I remember that wait clearly. The house itself seemed burdened with silence. Somewhere upstairs, servants moved cautiously, their footsteps subdued as though tragedy itself lingered beneath the roof. Outside, the pale winter sky stretched cold and motionless over Streatham. Holder sat near the fire, twisting his hands. "What do you make of him, Doctor?" he asked at length. I smiled faintly. You ask a difficult question. Does he truly see hope for Arthur? I have learned, said I honestly, never to predict Holmes's conclusions. Yet, privately, I remained uncertain. Though Holmes had raised objections to the obvious explanation, I still found it difficult to dismiss the evidence against Arthur. The silence lengthened. Nearly an hour passed. At last, footsteps sounded in the hall. Holmes returned. His boots were heavy with snow, and damp frost glittered upon his coat. Yet his expression remained as unreadable as ever. Well, cried Holder eagerly. Holmes removed his gloves. I believe, said he calmly, that I have now seen all there is to see. The banker stared. You know where the jewels are? I cannot yet say. The disappointment which crossed Holder's face pained me. Then, my son, my opinion, Holmes answered, has not altered. The banker spread his hands despairingly. But what happened? What dark business occurred beneath my roof? Holmes buttoned his coat. If you visit Baker Street tomorrow morning, between 9 and 10, said he, I shall endeavour to make matters clearer. Holder looked astonished. Tomorrow? Yes, but surely, Holmes interrupted gently, you gave me complete freedom to act, providing only that I recover the stones. Certainly. And no limitation as to expense? None whatever. Excellent. Holmes reached for his hat. I shall continue the matter tonight. There was something in his voice which told me that his thoughts had travelled much farther than his words revealed. The banker, though dissatisfied, could do little except agree. After brief farewells, we departed Fairbank. Throughout the journey back to London, I repeatedly attempted to draw Holmes into discussion. He defeated every effort. Once or twice he answered vaguely. More often he diverted the conversation altogether. At length, I abandoned the attempt. He sat sunk in thought beside the railway window, and I knew from experience that silence served him better than inquiry. We reached Baker Street sometime before 3. Holmes entered our sitting-room, that it disappeared immediately into his bedroom. A few minutes later, he emerged. I confess I scarcely recognized him. Gone was the consulting detective. In his place stood an ill-dressed loafer of the lowest London sort. His collar was turned high. His coat appeared greasy and threadbare. A bright red cravat hung untidily beneath unshaven features. The transformation was extraordinary. I think this should answer, said he, studying himself in the mirror. I laughed. Where are you bound now? He cut himself a rough sandwich from the sideboard while speaking. That, said he, depends upon whether I pursue truth or merely a will-o'-the-wisp. I knew the tone. He had found a promising scent. You suspect someone, perhaps. He slipped the sandwich into his pocket. I only regret, Watson, that you cannot accompany me. And with that, he departed. The hours passed slowly. Late afternoon deepened toward evening. I occupied myself with medical journals and occasional reflection upon the curious affair. Yet no theory satisfied me. Holmes returned briefly, near tea-time. He entered, swinging a worn elastic-sided boot in his hand. Without explanation, he tossed it into the corner. You have been successful, I asked. Oh, moderately. He poured tea, as though returning from an ordinary stroll. You have gone back to Streatham? Yes, but not to the house. His eyes twinkled faintly. It is a charming little problem. I noticed at once that his spirits had risen considerably, though he concealed it beneath casual speech. Excitement stirred beneath the surface. Before I could question him further, he stood. "No waiting up tonight, Watson," said he. "I may be late." And once again he vanished into London. Midnight came. Still no Holmes. This caused me little concern, for such absences were common when he pursued an investigation. Eventually, I retired. When I descended next morning to breakfast, however, there sat Holmes, already dressed and immaculate, coffee beside him, and newspaper in hand, looking perfectly refreshed. "You will forgive my beginning without you," said he. "You were late?" "Somewhat." His expression remained maddeningly calm. Then the bell rang. Holmes glanced toward the door. "I believe," said he quietly, "that our client has arrived." And indeed, it was Alexander Holder. Yet scarcely had I looked upon him before I recoiled in shock. For in a single night, the unhappy banker appeared to have aged years, and the sorrow he carried this morning proved even heavier than before. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Baker Street when Alexander Holder entered our sitting-room once again. I scarcely recognized him. Only yesterday he had appeared a prosperous financier, overcome by sudden calamity. Now he looked a man worn down by sorrow itself. His broad face had fallen inward, fatigue shadowed his eyes, and even his hair appeared whiter than before. He sank heavily into the chair Holmes offered him. "I do not know," said he miserably, "what offence I have committed against Providence." Holmes folded his newspaper. "You have suffered fresh trouble." The banker gave a broken nod. "My niece, Mary, has gone." I started. "Gone. She has deserted my house." The words seemed to pain him more deeply than even Arthur's arrest. Her room, he told us, had not been slept in, but before a pawn table lay only by him note. With trembling hands he withdrew it and read aloud. "My dearest uncle," it began. She wrote that she believed herself the cause of his misery. Had she acted differently, she feared, the catastrophe might never have occurred. Therefore, she could no longer remain beneath his roof. He must not seek her, for she was provided for, and intended never to return. The letter ended simply, "Your loving Mary." Holder lowered the paper. "What does it mean, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, desperately. "Can it point to self-destruction?" Holmes shook his head immediately. "No, quite the reverse." The banker stared. "I believe," said Holmes quietly, "that this development may prove the happiest circumstance available to us." Holder looked bewildered. Then Holmes asked, "You still wish the coronet recovered?" "My God, yes." "And the reward?" "I would pay any sum." Holmes nodded. £3,000 should suffice. Without hesitation, Holder seized his checkbook. Holmes watched him write. Then, with the calmest movement imaginable, my friend crossed to his desk and withdrew something small, wrapped carefully within paper. He opened it. A flash of gold caught the morning light. 3 magnificent beryls gleamed before us. Holder uttered a strangled cry. The missing corner of the coronet lay upon the table. He sprang forward. "You have them." The banker clutched the jewels with trembling hands, overcome by relief. "I am saved," he gasped. The force of his emotion shook him visibly, yet Holmes remained grave. "There is another debt," said he. Holder reached instantly for his pen. "Name it." "It is not owed to me." Holmes's voice sharpened slightly. "You owe an apology to your son." The banker froze. "Arthur?" "Yes." Holder stared in disbelief. "Then he was innocent? I told you yesterday he was." The poor man sank back, stunned beyond speech. "Holmes," said I involuntarily, "you astonish me." Holmes settled into his chair. "The explanation," said he, "is simpler than appearances suggested." He turned toward Holder. "Yet I must first tell you something painful." The banker clutched the recovered jewels. "It concerns Mary." At once anxiety returned to his face. Holmes spoke quietly. "There existed an understanding between your niece and Sir George Burnwell. The effect proved devastating." Holder rose halfway from his chair. "Impossible, unfortunately." Holmes replied, "It is quite certain." The banker shook his head violently. "No, Mary would never—" "My dear sir," said Holmes gently, "you knew Sir George only as a charming gentleman. I knew something of his reputation already." And Holmes described the man plainly. A ruined gambler, a practiced seducer, brilliant in manner, and utterly without conscience. "Your niece," said Holmes, "was inexperienced. She believed herself loved." Holder covered his face. "I confess even I felt sorrow then, for Mary's quiet dignity at Fairbank had impressed me greatly. She met him secretly," Holmes continued, "most likely for some time." The banker groaned. "No, when you revealed the existence of the coronet," Holmes said, "the temptation became irresistible." Now Holmes began to reconstruct the events that fatal night. As he spoke, the entire mystery unfolded before us, like a curtain drawn aside. Mary, believing her uncle asleep, had descended to the hall window, opening toward the stable lane. There Sir George waited. Holmes had found his tracks pressed deep into the snow. She informed him of the coronet, and Burnwell, greedy and desperate, persuaded her to obtain it. "She scarcely had time to obey," Holmes continued, "before you appeared, descending the stairs. Alarmed, Mary hurriedly shut the window, and diverted suspicion by speaking of Lucy Parr and her wooden-legged admirer, a story which, incidentally, proved perfectly true." Holder stared at Holmes with horror. "But Arthur, your son," said Holmes, "went to bed troubled over his debts, and unable to sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard movement outside his room. Looking out, he observed Mary moving stealthily toward the dressing-room. Surprised, he dressed hastily and followed unseen. Hidden nearby, Arthur watched his cousin emerge carrying the coronet. He saw her descend. He saw her open the hall window, and he saw her pass the treasure into waiting hands beyond. Holder gripped the chair. My God! As long as Mary remained present, Holmes continued, Arthur could not interfere without exposing the woman he loved. The truth struck us all at once. Arthur loved Mary still. That explained everything. But once she returned upstairs, Holmes said, he acted instantly. At Fortum, and half-dressed, Arthur rushed outside into the snow and pursued Burnwell down the lane. There, a struggle followed. The two men wrestled over the coronet. Each pulled violently. Sir George struck. Arthur fought back. And during that struggle, Holmes pointed toward the damaged jewel. The coronet broke. Holder sat speechless. His son, whom he had called thief and criminal, had in truth been trying to save both family and honor. For several moments after Holmes finished speaking, no one in our Baker Street sitting room uttered a single word. The fire whispered softly. Outside, London moved through its morning business, unaware that within 221B, a father's world had just been overturned. Alexander Holder sat motionless. The recovered jewels remained clasped in his shaking hand. At last he found his voice, and Arthur, he whispered, my poor boy. Holmes inclined his head. Your son returned with the larger portion of the coronet. I listened closely, for though much had now become clear, Holmes had not yet revealed the full chain of reasoning by which he reached his conclusions. Holder leaned forward desperately. Then when I found him, he'd had only just returned, Holmes said. Arthur, after struggling with Burnwell in the lane, managed to wrench back most of the coronet. Yet one broken corner, containing the 3 missing beryls, remained in the villain's possession. He rushed back toward the house, barefoot, breathless, still clutching the damaged treasure. He closed the window and hurried upstairs, Holmes continued. There, realizing that the coronet had been twisted during the struggle, he attempted to straighten it. And it was at that exact moment his father entered. Holder pressed his hands against his face. "Oh, God! You accused him," said Holmes gently, "at the very instant he believed he deserved gratitude." The banker groaned aloud. "How blind I have been!" Yet Holmes was not finished. "Your son's silence, though unfortunate, was entirely honorable." I nodded slowly. Now I understood. Arthur had remained silent, not because guilt trapped him, but because love did. To expose the truth meant destroying Mary. Even after her betrayal, he chose to protect her. Holder shook his head in misery. "And I called him thief." His voice broke. Holmes continued calmly. "When I examined the grounds yesterday, the snow told nearly the entire story. This, dear listener, was the part I always found most fascinating, for no lesson better revealed Holmes' singular genius than the manner in which he read meaning where others saw only disorder. He leaned back in his chair and explained. "At first," I said, "I inspected the tradesman's path. There he discovered the marks of Lucy Parr and her admirer. The wooden-legged greengrocer Mary had described. Their tracks explained themselves," Holmes said. The woman had hurried back toward the kitchen door, while the man lingered briefly before departing. That clue, therefore, proved genuine but irrelevant. The true revelation waited elsewhere. "In the stable lane," Holmes said, "I found two separate sets of tracks. One belonged to a booted man, the other to a barefoot runner." I felt again the thrill I had experienced hearing this the first time. The booted tracks had walked calmly in both directions, Holmes explained. The barefoot marks, however, more telling still. At places the naked footprints lay atop the boot impressions, meaning Arthur had followed later. Then Holmes found signs of struggle. Snow churned violently, drops of blood, and finally, the path of retreat. "The wounded man," said Holmes, "had fled toward the main road. Everything aligned perfectly. Still, one question remained. Who was the booted stranger?" Holmes folded his hands. "Once I knew the coronet, once savicviti. Once I knew the coronet, and subtlety. Not holder, not a servants. Only Mary remained." "And Mary," said Holmes, "then necessarily a lover?" Holder lowered his eyes. The logic, painful though it proved, was undeniable. Among the few men entering that household, only one suited the circumstances. Sir George Burnwell. I had already heard unpleasant things regarding him, Holmes said. Thus Holmes disguised himself and journeyed to Burnwell's residence. There, through skillful conversation and modest bribery, he learned an important detail. Burnwell had returned home injured. "A cut near the eye," Holmes said. "Precisely where Arthur's blow would have landed." Still, Holmes sought certainty. And here he smiled faintly. "For 6 shillings, said he, "I purchased one of Sir George's cast-off boots." I laughed despite the solemnity of the tale. Holmes's methods often balanced oddly between scholarship and mischief. Returning to Streatham in disguise, he compared the boot to the impressions. A perfect fit. Holder stared at him in amazement. "So you knew by then," Holmes answered. I possessed certainty. Yet recovering the jewels remained difficult. Burnwell, after all, knew prosecution endangered the Holder family as much as himself. Thus, Holmes visited him directly. At first, he denied everything. I could imagine the meeting vividly. Two dangerous minds confronting one another. But when I supplied every detail, Holmes said dryly, he attempted violence. From the wall, Burnwell seized a life-preserver. Holmes, however, had anticipated as much. I placed a pistol to his head. The banker stared. "You armed yourself?" "My dear sir," said Holmes, "one must adapt to circumstances." Burnwell's courage weakened considerably thereafter. He confessed that he had already sold the gems to a receiver. £600, Holmes said, with disdain. For all three, negotiation followed. Promises, threats, careful bargaining, and at last Holmes recovered the stones. "I reached home near 2 o'clock, said he, "after what I may describe as a moderately active evening." For the first time Holder rose and seized Holmes's hand. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking, "England owes you gratitude, and I owe you far more." But Holmes gently withdrew. "There remains more urgent duty." The banker understood immediately. His face crumpled. "Yes," he whispered, I must go to him. He turned toward the door, then hesitated. And Mary? He asked, brokenly. Holmes's expression softened. She is wherever Sir George may be. The answer carried little comfort. Yet Holmes added quietly, whatever her wrongdoing, I suspect life itself will prove a harsher judge than any court. Holder bowed his head. Then, clutching the restored coronet, he departed hurriedly from Baker Street. The door closed behind him. For some time neither Holmes nor I spoke. At length I looked toward my friend. You pitied Arthur, said I. Holmes gazed thoughtfully into the dying fire. A man, he answered, may survive injustice more easily than betrayal. And thus ended the strange affair of the Beryl Coronet, an adventure which taught me once again that beneath scandal and accusation, the human heart often hides truths far more complicated than crime alone. And now, dear listener, our lamps burn low at 22 1B Baker Street. Until our next journey, I remain Dr. John Watson.